I'm Beth Pariseau, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. Dan Lorenc previously joined us as a guest during Season 1 of IT Ops Query, which was focused on open source sustainability. Dan originally developed the tooling that would become the Sigstore project, which helps verify the provenance of open source code packages while working at Google. Sigstore is now governed by the OpenSSF, where Dan is a member of the Technical Advisory Council. He is also co-founder and CEO of Chainguard, a software supply chain security startup that has recently pivoted to focus primarily on hardened Chainguard images. Thanks very much for being with us again, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
So when we talked earlier this year about risk in open source software and a lack of incentives to give back to widely used projects, you mentioned that government regulation could play a part in changing that by enforcing liability on companies that ship software with vulnerable components. But I'm wondering, have you seen that happen in any significant way this year?
I've seen the government regulation continue, but it's a slow moving ship. The CRA just got finally ratified in Europe, which has a bunch of
Hmm.
liability clauses inside of it. And the US government is still pushing toward that. But these things don't happen overnight. Companies don't have to change the way they're operating the next day when these things start getting announced and start getting pushed forward. So I'd say it's still moving in the right direction, but it hasn't really changed the way anyone is thinking about software development yet.
Do you think the change in presidential administration will have any effect on that, or will that continue?
I'm sure it'll have some effect. I don't think anybody could possibly
Uh,
tell you what that's going to be at this point yet. I
right.
know every administration is very concerned about cybersecurity, particularly with a national security lens on it. Attacks coming from other nation states affect everyone, but
Mm-hmm.
approaches are probably going to vary a little bit in how to deal with them.
Right. And so then a separate but related thread that we talked about previously was open source business models
Yeah.
and sustainability. There have been multiple efforts to come up with new forms of licensing for open source products, and there have been some new companies spun up like Adam Jacobs System Initiative with new business model approaches. Have any of those efforts stood out to you this year? Do you think the market's found more of a footing there?
I love what Adam has done with his trademark policy and the way that he thinks about productizing the stuff inside of the system initiative. He's written amazing blogs explaining how to do open source and how to make it work. I don't
Mm.
think people are listening yet to folks like Adam that kind of understand where the pitfalls are. But I do think we've seen a pullback in some areas, and venture funding and the economy over the last couple of years hasn't been quite as bubbly and zero interest rate phenomenon as it was
Hmm.
a while ago. So I don't think there are quite as many companies getting started without real sustainable paths forward as there were. I wish more people listened to Adam and it was a result of his stuff, but my guess is that it's just a little bit harder to get funding without more of an idea on what your business model is going to look like up front.
Yeah, just fewer underwear gnomes, as
Yeah,
we
yeah.
referenced in
I
the
love
last
that South Park
episode.
episode. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, getting back to the CRA, there were
Mhm.
some objections earlier in the year to how that might affect open source
Yeah.
projects. Were those ironed out, or does that remain an issue?
So the CRA is the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. It's been under discussion for a while. One of the most problematic clauses in there was enforcement of really strict liability changes in software that's being used inside of Europe. And they didn't
Mm.
really carve out open source. So if you published or produced software that didn't meet security standards and that made its way into products inside of Europe through no fault or maybe even desire of your own, there were chances that you could be held liable for damages from that product. And that kind of flies counter to everything about modern businesses and software and open source in general.
Yeah.
If you read the first line of pretty much any open source license, it starts with the software comes with no warranties of any form. You
Right.
don't get to sue us if anything bad happens. It's on you from the time you take that and put it into your software. And they had some kind of strange carve outs that they thought would address this by saying, all right, if the software isn't produced with any kind of commercial structure around it, then it's fine. So if you're just at home in your basement putting stuff online, you're probably fine.
Mm.
But if, say, you work for a company and happen to publish some code that you just wrote, now all of a sudden that company does exist for commercial purposes. And if,
Oh,
hey, some
God.
big bank in Europe takes it and uses it, even if you have no contract with that bank, that software was still produced commercially, so you could still be held liable.
Wow.
They've tweaked it a bit. It's still not somewhere good. They have made it a little bit
Hmm.
better. It's not perfect. They've also introduced the concept of stewards, where big
Hmm.
foundations, kind of like the Linux Foundation or Apache Foundation or Eclipse Foundation, can act as that kind of central authority around taking the liability so maintainers don't have to, and they can kind of act as a choke point for trying to enforce and implement some of the practices inside of it, which is good. It's way better than a whole bunch of individual people getting sued, but it still places a huge burden on those foundations and now puts them in this central, authoritative, risky position with liability. The other kind of strange part with just how regulations work in Europe is, yeah, it gets passed centrally by the EU, but then it takes a while to get interpreted by every single jurisdiction inside Europe. And some people might interpret everything in there differently, and you kind of have to wait for judges in individual countries to start interpreting and deciding what it's going to look like. So
Mm,
better than it was, still not very encouraging, and it's going to
yeah.
take some time to see the real impacts.
And then meanwhile, we had the executive order in this country which alluded to
Yeah.
liability for insecure software. But
Mhm.
as we talked about during KubeCon,
Yeah.
just in enterprise IT, in public sector has sort of lost momentum. Some of that has become really fragmented.
Yeah.
Why do you think that happened?
It takes a while to do any large scale change like this. So I
Mm,
bet if you ask the regulators, it's going on schedule. If you're working at a company, it's probably feels like it's taking way too long. The kind of multi-phased approach here that they sort of sketched and outlined was number one, codify what best practices for software development actually are. It's kind of
mm,
strange that we've never had that as an industry of best practices for how to operate software, how to do password
mm,
management, those kind of things, but never anything that applied to the actual development lifecycle itself.
mm,
And so that takes a while because they're not experts in this. And so NIST goes and interviews industry leaders, figures out what's common, what's not common, where they want to push, where they're just kind of ratifying things everyone already does. And then they produce a long document about these are the best practices according to NIST after extensive consultation with industry leaders. And
mhm,
that happened, and that was pretty quick. And it's a really good document. It's called the Secure
mm,
Software Development Framework. It's I don't know, like 500 pages of cross references to other frameworks and things, but it's a good collection. And now that they have that, it's kind of this minimum baseline of these are the things everyone should be doing if they're going to be producing software responsibly. But NIST also can't make people listen to them. That's not their scope. They're just kind of distillers of information. So then the next couple steps have to come from Congress or the White House in different forms. We are starting to see that document make its way into procurement. So, one of the biggest tools the government has is that they're one of the largest buyers of software on the planet as a whole.
right.
And so they can start to say stuff like, we won't buy your software unless you do this. And that has a really big impact on the industry when it happens. And we're starting to see that happen now. The form factor of that is an attestation letter that the CEO or some very high level director at companies has to sign that says, we do everything in this document. It's a self attestation. So you do it yourself. There's no audit behind it. But it's pretty scary. The very first paragraph in that is you're signing this, and if you lie to the government, you go to jail. It's not like a
Mm,
civil slap on the wrist fine, it's perjury to the government. That's a felony. Self attestation is kind of a way to kickstart this until an
mm,
industry forms around doing third party attestations and third party audits and everything, which we're starting to see. Some of the stuff is already in common with FedRAMP. So some of the people that already do FedRAMP audits, they're called 3PAOs, are starting to also offer this as a service where then they assume the liability after coming in and checking your systems. If they say it's good, then they checked it out. Trust that. It's all a long process that takes a while to get through, but it's moving. The gears are still turning.
is it just that it's not the latest shiny object anymore, that buyers are starting to drift a little?
No, I wouldn't say that. It's just a multi-stage thing where if you're selling to the government, you're probably paying very close attention to it right now because that's where the first part of
Mhm.
this hits. But one of the clauses in there is that you're supposed to start requiring the same thing for your vendors too. And so that's sort of where it,
Ah,
it goes from just people that are selling software directly to the government, the DoD, then they're going to start requiring it for their vendors. And it's a supply chain where everybody's in business with somebody that's in business with somebody that's in business with the government. You can't get too many hops away. So it will
mm.
spread, but that first phase, people are taking it seriously just in that narrow industry vertical so far, but it will spread.
At the same time, things like SBOMs seem to be in a weird sort of limbo
Yeah.
because there are still people who are really strenuously advocating for them. But at
Yeah.
the same time, I think a lot of the wind was taken out of the sails when CISA's self attestation form didn't include any mention of it.
Yeah.
What is up with that? Why did that happen? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, I hope it goes nowhere. It's such a strange thing. S-bombs have value. You can't say they're completely worthless, but if you asked
Mm,
any serious security leader to stack rank their priorities on what
mm,
they think is actually most impactful to their company, S-bomb is going to be nowhere in that list.
huh.
Yeah, it takes all the conversation. It takes up all the space whenever people are talking about this because it's such a controversial one. Yeah, I consulted on some panels. I got asked my opinion when they were figuring out what to put in there. And if you look at any of the major supply chain breaches that have actually happened since that executive order or even before it, SBOM wouldn't have helped in any of them. It's almost like a contrived use case at this point, waiting for something to make it more important that probably isn't going to come. The whole premise behind SBOMs is that you already have to have super accurate inventory information to even know what SBOMs you should be looking at and managing.
Mm.
And then maybe if you have those, you can speed up your vulnerability remediation time a little bit. But that's just not the case in practice. And people are stuck relying on vendors anyway, even if they find
Hmm.
out something is out of date. What can they do? Just send a couple more angry emails faster asking for patches? You're kind of
Yeah.
already on the hook waiting for them to patch, whether you know what's in there or not.
Mm. Good point. So, is this getting into what happened with Chainguard's pivot to focus on images? Was that part of the impetus?
Not really. If it's a strong word, it kind of looks
Okay.
like one, but we had been working on images the whole time, and it finally just took off and blew up for us to the point where we didn't have
Ah.
any resources to spend on anything else, and it was pretty obvious
Hmm.
at that point. We got pulled the wrong way early on with a different product where it looked like there was more demand than there was, and that slowed down
Mm-hmm.
right around the same time demand for our images product blew up for us.
Mm.
So it was more like we leaned in where the demand was coming and kept going there and went as fast as we could.
So, aside from what the market was telling you, what makes images a more popular approach?
It's not a supply chain security tool. Really, what we're selling is just a secure supply chain
Mm.
that happens to be in an images format. Containers have been around for a while. Adoption has grown. It's continuing to grow. They're finally kind of crossing that chasm and making their way into the most regulated and security conscious orgs that are typically slowest to adopt.
Mm.
And there's a huge set of security concerns that are just sitting there inside these massive container images that everyone is downloading and grabbing from the internet. So that combination of a lot of scrutiny on it, such a widely deployed format, makes it easy to focus on since almost everyone is running containers in some form today. And then all the known vulnerabilities and unknown ones in malware getting slipped in through open source supply chains kind of made it the perfect product at the perfect time for us.
Okay. So, the obligatory predictions, since we're coming up on the end of the
Yeah.
year here, let's start with software supply chain. How do you see that playing out? Do you think the images approach will find a regulatory driver? Do you think the regulation will finally kick into play? What do you think will happen there?
There's a lot of value propositions you get out of our images, but I think one of the main ones is just dealing with known CVEs that are sitting in the NVD, also run by NIST today. There's a lot of noise in that ecosystem. Everyone knows it. Only a small subset of CVEs are actually exploitable, but there's so many you have to look at that if there's thousands of them on your dashboard and you know only 4% are real, that's still a large number and it's a ton of noise you have to sift through. So killing that pain at the root by fixing all of them and integrating with vulnerability scanners and eliminating that noise resonates really well with people today. It's too much risk to just accept, even if you know that a lot of them aren't real. And that's only continuing to get worse. You see blog posts all the time of people just spamming projects with AI generated vulnerability reports that aren't real either, and they're taking up noise and getting CVE entries anyway, is only
Wow.
making that problem worse. And the more open source you have too, the more noise you have to deal with just because people are kind of flooding all of the projects with this stuff. So I think that's only going to continue to get worse.
Well, if the gears of government are still slowly turning with regard to self attestation and older methods, how long will it take for that approach to filter its way into regulation?
Yeah, the vulnerability stuff is already in regulations. You have to deal with known vulnerabilities. There's scoring. That's not anything new. It's just the problems getting multiplied with containers, and that's causing a lot of pain. The NVD ran into a bunch of funding issues too at the start of the
Yeah.
year that are still kind of shaking their way out. They're sort of back on track, but it was such a big backlog to get through. The
Mm.
Linux kernel started reporting CVs too for the first time this year. Up until now,
Hmm.
they hadn't been. Now they became their own CNA, a CVE naming or numbering authority, something like that. And they're filing lots of entries because there's lots
Hmm.
of attack surface scope inside of the Linux kernel, but that's also adding a lot of noise for people. The typical user of the Linux kernel code base is only using something like 5 to 10% when you look at which drivers they're using, which features, but which 5 to 10% varies across every organization who's running it in different ways. And
Yeah.
the CV system isn't fine grained enough to filter out the ones you're not using based on your compile flags. It's just if it's in Linux, it's going to show up in your scanner if you have Linux, and you've got to do the work to prove that you don't have that piece
Mm.
of code. So the noise is only increasing, and people need better tools to filter that out and
Mm.
get the real signal. But that's just the known vulnerability piece.
Mm.
The unknown or malicious code piece, which isn't really handled well by the CVE system. The CVE system is for unintentional vulnerabilities.
Mm.
Malicious code, for the most part, does not get a CVE entry. If somebody purposefully adds malicious code to a project, that's usually out of scope for a vulnerability. That's more like an attack or something, which is tracked differently. And that's continuing to explode as well. We've probably seen 5 or 6 this week alone. There was one really large scale one on this AI project, but it was really subtle. The attackers attacked the GitHub build system of this project,
Mm.
stole a bunch of
Hmm.
credentials, and got malware published directly into PyPI. And this wasn't
Oh,
just some
yeah.
tiny thing. Normally, it's just people spamming and uploading typo squatting things, hoping someone downloads them. But this one was a real targeted attack. Ultralytics was the name. Ultralytics was the name of this really popular AI project, and it was a really sophisticated attack. And it's
Yikes.
to the point where if you pip install something, you could be compromised. And the rate of attacks there is only increasing too. And that's something
Mm.
that people haven't really had to deal with malicious code being put into their supply chain until recently.
Mm.
And none of the ecosystems are really set up well to handle that one. The timeline on finding it and fixing it was still really quick. The PyPI project has recently integrated Sigstore into the release system for Wheels. Wheels are the package format, and it was
Mhm.
really awesome to see that help speed it up and trace the exact attack point back down using all that metadata. But it can't prevent any of this. It just makes it easier and
Mhm.
faster to recover from. And so I think
Right.
it's going to be an arms race there, and who can detect and prevent that stuff from making its way in and making its way out to users faster.
So interesting times will continue.
Yeah.
Safe to say.
Yeah, the CVE stuff isn't going to go away, but I predict a
Mm.
much bigger focus on malicious code in the open source supply chain next year.
Right. And so that's where the images approach is just don't pip install things. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, these attacks are on the build system in the package repository. And yeah, if you're following the SSDF from NIST, hopefully that's all hardened
Mm.
for you. But you can't go require that for every one of the thousands or tens of thousands of open source projects and maintainers out there that you're using. And there are good efforts and people are raising the bar there, but they're going to be behind the pace because you can't just go force open source maintainers to do things securely. By and large, they
Mhm.
want to, but it's still a lot of work that they have to go through and you can't go require it. So the choices are
Mm.
either don't use open source at all, which isn't really going to fly, or build it all yourself, which some of the largest organizations out there do today, but it's very expensive and very hard,
Mm.
or get someone else to build it for you securely, all the open source you're using. And that's kind of the approach we're taking.
Right. There have also been efforts for end-to-end attestation and signing happening. What's your outlook on that?
Again, it's been really slow. I think, some of the
Mm.
most security sensitive organizations are doing it internally, mostly as a way to prevent and reduce insider risk. So somebody inside of your company trying to tamper with some of the code on the way out,
Mhm.
that's really the only way to protect against it, those attestation platforms. But again, it leaves the whole open source side just sitting out there open and prime for attack.
So, on the open source front, as far as the sustainability and business model thread, do people start
Yeah.
listening to Adam in 2025? What do you think happens there?
It's like the you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink kind of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm baffled in some ways just how many companies ignore a lot of that advice or maybe haven't heard of it and get started with this idea of make a really popular open source project, figure out how to make money on it later, and then get upset when someone else figured out how to make money off of it better than they did. And it's kind of the
Yeah.
cycle that just keeps repeating. And Adam's got a perfect playbook out there, and people just don't want to do it early on.
Yeah. So, speaking of cycles repeating, it's a little bit orthogonal to your focus with supply chain, but a lot of the conversations I've had in the more recent episodes of this podcast this year have been about security operations and the state thereof. Do you have any observations on that yourself from this year or any ideas about how that might be poised to play out in 2025?
You're talking about SOCs inside of companies and incident response and that
Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen dozens of pitches for AI enabled SOCs and stuff like this. And it's something like that's probably going to work. I love the usage of AI to help make people more effective and help make teams more effective and not completely replace these analysts. There's always human judgment and human insight in the loop required. But yeah, it's a
Mm.
massive signal to noise problem where these SOCs are sitting there reviewing access logs and audit alerts and stuff from massively growing teams and SaaS platforms ballooning and trying to centralize all of that. And getting AI as a first pass to help you figure out what to do or see if something is real and do pattern detection. I think
Mhm.
it's going to be necessary. I don't know when or which one of these platforms is really going to take off though.
What about AI in the supply chain security space? Is that something you're seeing come in?
There's tons of code generation tools and stuff out there,
Mhm.
GitHub Copilot, stuff like that to make engineers more productive. It's sort of that paradigm shift, though, of more code getting produced faster than people can really secure it and update it. It's the same thing with the bug reports and vulnerability reports. Daniel Stenberg, the curl maintainer, just posted a statement yesterday requiring people to disclose whether or not they used AI in every vulnerability report, requiring them to sign something saying they did review it before sending it to him and they're just not sending throwing
Mm,
AI slop that comes right out of the tool his way and making him filter it.
right.
Yeah, you can see some of these large projects that have a lot of eyes on them already starting to struggle with the load of these entries. There are great results too, though. Like if you look at some of the work Google's published using AI to generate fuzz targets that take a lot of human time and effort, and then running those and catching real issues by doing things that are typically hard to scale and getting function calls that you just couldn't do manually, and
Mm.
finding bugs and finding real issues that way. So you can't really ignore it and say it's net harmful, but it is going to produce a lot of load for the people dealing with results until we'll figure out a good way and responsible way of dealing with it.
AI giveth and AI taketh away,
Yeah.
I think. Well, thanks again for sharing your insights once again, and I hope you have happy holidays and a happy new year.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions, comments, or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at B as in boy, P as in Peter, A R I S as in Samuel, E A U at techtarget.com. Please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice.